July 4th. Got there, and the ground was covered with bodies. Lay down with everyone and looked at the sky, bracing for the explosions. Miracles. We watched our father take the jar out to the patio on the day we had been waiting for ever since he put the spider into it with its egg sac. It was a black widow spider, which we knew never to touch in the garden and to know by the red bow on its belly. We'd been living in the country since our stark, raving mad mother started calling the apartment from her orbit. Our father lay down near the jar on his side. He was always showing us stuff around the farm. He was growing a beard, always tired and patient. There was a barn with a horse in it we were taking care of. He said a lot about learning to take care of others as a part of growing up, and we watched him with eyes too big for our heads. We gathered around the jar and put our noses to it in turn, looking for the movement he said to look for in the egg sac, how you could see it was timed by shadows crossing. We were getting a little bored when the babies started to come out, just like he said. They were smaller than anything, and the big mother spider, you couldn't tell if she was paying attention. The babies were spreading out over the inside of the jar, the miracle of life. They were making their ways to the air holes punched in the lid. Our father just watched and commented for our benefit. He put a stick to an air hole, and we watched babies crawl up it. Spiders crawl their whole lives. We watched, but some of our attention wandered. We were new to the countryside, new life surrounding us. I remember a lot of things from that place besides this. After the apocalypse, a brother of mine said, "Do you remember if you were nervous with all those poison spiders radiating from the jar? Do you remember that we didn't have any insect spray because we just moved out there, but he had a can of hairspray and that's what he sprayed on them, just as they were getting away? Why did we have hairspray? Was it hers?" Virgins. Never mind, this is what happened to Betsy. It's what they say. She grew a tail. They ripped it from her. It divided her butt. I'm kidding. But you know how you can tell when a girl loses her virginity is you look at her ass. If it's clenched up, she's fine. But if it's got a space, like if you look at her ass, you can tell because obviously there's room now. Seriously, pay attention when you go by. Apocalypses passed. After the apocalypse, we didn't even talk about all the crap we'd read about it before or seen in movies. Like we were embarrassed of our we were embarrassed of our whole species' imagination. Even what we'd gotten right just seemed uncool to do, as opposed to cannibalism, which was pretty reasonable, or wanton sex, which was necessary, heroic even given the state of so many of our physiques. One day, or night, or whatever it was, we were sitting around a campfire, and I was like, what do I keep trying to remember? And it was ghost stories. I mean, never in real life did I ever actually tell a ghost story. I just saw it in so many movies, it seemed like, having been a kid, I must have done it. Like stealing cookies from a jar, which I never did either. Who has a cookie jar? No one ever again, you can bet on it. So, there we were, all fucking and eating each other by the fire. And I kept having all these apocalypse stories from my childhood, right there on the tip of my tongue. But for everyone's sake, I held back. Metaphor. At the brainstem, madness hunkered like a bomb the size of a baby's fist. It was not a stone, as our ancestors believed, because a stone remains stone. The bomb is scientific. Madness is mostly disintegration. The little fist is a little baby's fist, but if the baby wiggles its fingers, you're done for. Anything can happen to set the baby off. You can get raped, take drugs, or fall out with your mother. You can think a bad thought or a magic word. A baby can grow into all kinds of baby. You can go on with your life with the baby living in, off, or on your body. Madness is some of your eggs that you could ovulate now or never. Madness dams the river in your dick, hair over time in a drain. I know in the end it's not like you are one thing and madness is another. It is a sleeping fist of your own stone, bomb, dick, damn babies. Hangings. Already this year, he had inherited the clothes of 2 famous dead people. At least one had killed himself, and he knew both tertiarily. This current one, a third, was his wife's mentor, and he and his wife had gone to visit the widow, where she'd holed up in a house by the sea. In evening light, the dead mentor's wife looked at his wife across the broad planks of the table in a room filled with rugs and masks from around the world. He was walking around looking at the masks while the women were talking quietly when he heard the woman say something to his wife about his frame. He thought about picture frames. Was his body a frame, or was his body in a frame? Skin as frame? Was his skeleton his frame? And what's all that about? Inner beauty, what you hang it on. There was framed art in other rooms of the house, but in this room, it was just the masks. He thought about his face, his brain behind his face, thinking about his face. He was not good with people the way his wife was, but he was just as smart. There were a lot of good places to hang yourself in this house, though he knew it had happened at the place in the city. At least let him try the suits, the wife of his wife's mentor was saying. They're here, in the closet upstairs. Hanging, everyone thought. I have someone for the sweaters, she said. He thought of himself in the dead man's sweaters, perhaps 6 of them, one over another, gray and brown, bulging, soundproofing his chest. He had the sweaters of another famous man already, buried in a closet in the hall at home. The man who'd been promised the sweaters had been there for brunch. Now he stood in the hedges, watching the women talk, and the man poke his finger into the eye of a mask and touch the wall behind it. The man in the hedges had been in the same cohort as the wife. They'd been rivals for the mentor's attention and occasional lovers, and the dead mentor had used them to challenge each other. The dead mentor had often been unfaithful to his wife. The mentor's wife had been unfaithful to him only once, years before her husband even started up with his conduct. And this had been with the man in the hedges. At lunch, the man in the hedges had said, "All I want are his sweaters. I loved him too, you know. Not like you, but he was a very important figure in my life." The word figure hung in the room, under the broad rough roof beams. A breeze came up the dunes, through the hedges and the window, and sketched squiggly lines around their heads. She thought about the word figure, about her body, what it could possibly mean to reason with it, with the body, once and for all. Only after he'd hung himself did so many people he'd fucked come out of the woodwork. Men, women, old people, young people. Loved, too, she suspected, some of them. Her husband had a lot of meaning, she kept being reminded. She told the man in the hedges, as she put the marmalade onto a muffin she was not going to eat, that she'd think about the sweaters or if there might be a better choice for him. A special book, she suggested, a piece of art, something small. The man said that back in the day you could smoke. Back in the day you could smoke. And the mentor had worn his sweaters and smoked all through class, letting butts pile up on the floor by his chair in the seminar room, so involved with what his students were thinking that it never crossed his mind to use the ashtray that sat on the table next to the case for his glasses. That's what it's all about in the end, he'd said to the wife. What we've done to each other up here. He tapped the side of his head. Tap, tap, as if it were fruit. The wife couldn't help it. Figures, she said. She'd be glad for him to take the sweaters. The women faced each other across the broad plank table. The man in the hedges watched them through the window, comparing the women's bodies to each other and his own body to the body of the other man, who took a mask off the wall and put it over his face and scanned the room through its eyes. The women looked deeper and deeper into each other's eyes. They both stared. They both started to well up with emotion. They reached their hands across the table to each other. One of them sniffed to shake the feeling. The other one said, "Where were we?" Then the man in the mask saw the man in the window and yelped. He dropped the mask, and it bounced once and then wobbled like a coin. But when he shot his eyes back to the window, he didn't see anything except the hedge, the reflection of the globe of a lamp, the moon above, and the dunes beyond it. He'd almost forgotten they were by the sea. He looked down at the mask and thought it must have made him see something that hadn't really been there. Hang it all, he thought. He'd never met the dead man, but he felt a longing for him when he looked at those women, so deep in each other's eyes, so filled with longing. It made him want, very much, to have the suits or anything else the dead man had left to offer. He looked forward to wearing them as any other clothes are worn, into the future, time doing its quiet business along the seams. That one's supposed to get all mixed up with perspective. It's okay. Memory. When I was a boy and they told us to lie down on the San Andreas fault to feel the tremors, I didn't feel anything. Reminds me, not long before that, I was in the Pied Piper, cast as a witch who had one early scene and one late scene. In the first scene, the Pied Piper said a line from the last scene. So I pictured the line in the script, white next to mine in yellow highlighter. And as I pronounced the line that followed it, my line, what I was meant to say as I saw it, all the rat's eyes went shifty. But everyone proceeded directly to the end of the play from there, and even the kids who never made it to the stage took their curtain call responsibly. At home, times like these, my mother would always say, "You're being so sensitive. It's not the end of the world." And I thought, well, then what is the end of the world? I never found out from her, so I imagined the apocalypse. I thought about how weird it would be to be a horse and have a crop hit you behind the saddle out of nowhere. Tahiti. Instead of the mood of the light from the kitchen, in the dark, in the heat, with the fronds from her limber plants at her elbows, suggesting Tahiti in the old days of painters now on coffee cups, she hoped a sheen would ease across her imagination, even as the earth fell away, as the animals died, as the fields fumed, as the turnips in the refrigerator shriveled into the faces of old ladies, like the one she would become if she only waited. It took something psychic to refrain from relaxing into one of the voices in the town that flattened real life. She took a piece of ice into her mouth and let it hurt, perhaps the last ice on earth. She took a look at the house and felt pickled. She turned her mind toward several moments in her history that were worth considering and watched the ideas turn in the atmosphere like model planets and then fail. Home, home, Home is where you used to think you wanted to go. Okay, you ready? This is the last stretch. There's like another little sequence. It just goes to the end. Another little sequence. Okay. Review. These people in the photo of the war and their babies look like dirt and rags and dirt. All fell, but especially the babies, who fell into the earth the way they had always fallen, into shoulders, into sleep, with small, complete weight. You understand that the bodies are dead because of the angles elucidated by the photograph. You are not convinced that the stillness is not the stillness of a photograph. As the photo suggests, you conflate what is rag, what is dirt, what is body. You put yourself in there, even in babies, and you know the angles your body can't do, even with yoga. The other reason you know they're dead is it says as much on a little card next to the photograph. You have come to an exhibit of photographs that has been praised for breathing. The reviewer stopped short of announcing that the pictures make the war come to life. He'd composed the review after visiting an ex-lover in the hospital, a sculptor who, quote, remained in a vegetative state. In the hospital, he tried to concentrate on the sheet veiling her and not the memory of her body. She had been a sculptor on her way to revitalizing classicism. They lived in an apartment with her resin figures. He'd been a photographer, losing faith in his own artistic promise. Her stillness was hard to take. He remembered the camera he loved, a Nikon he'd saved up for in 1965 and still brought out sometimes, usually alone in his apartment, usually after several drinks. Once, he'd found a mysterious roll of film among the pieces of fruit in the bowl on his countertop and had it developed. On it, objects in his life had been rendered monumental. He had not had children, he had not gone to war, he had not made good art, but when he looked at the photograph of his kettle, he found it difficult to breathe. The new me. They could stay afloat only for so long, before the deranged creatures picked them off. They were so thirsty or hungry. They swirled in the raging wind, fire, and water, their skin shriveled. Time had ended and yet passed. Parched, they watched the last particles of moisture rise and fade in the golden air above an earth of previously unknown colors. They trudged on, but the land was barren. Fungus rotted their limbs, and bacteria new to the dying world cruised their organs. Germs, maggots, and death from viral, microscopic life loomed in the near future. Buildings tumbled upon them. Flying debris severed them. Chasms opened wide and swallowed. They were crushed and strewn, and they exploded. Their brains burst from the noise. A spinning cow or lamp broke them. Their insides fell out. Their fingers crumbled. The inside of my skin was the earth, and grass took root and grew toward my heart. I had drunk and eaten enough pesticides to make it possible. My organs, robotic as zombies, worked with what they got. I saw myself clumping about, dribbling clippings from my razor-sharp teeth, pulsing with quotations. Versions. This one has a couple pages to it, so you have to keep track a little. Versions. Posters rose around the neighborhood describing a lost pigeon, which you might recognize because it might land on you. So meanwhile, I've been hanging out with this very sexy girl, Maggie, who always wants to be with me but doesn't want to date me. She's recently lost and found her giant cat, Hank, who's a typical Tom that way. Then she went to Spain, and people in her building were taking care of the cat, who was allowed to go in and out of the window. Back from Spain, there were posters around for another lost cat. The owners called her house and tried to convince her that Hank was actually their cat, the new lost one. Maggie won by saying Hank was at least 30% bigger than their cat. I don't know if she knew their cat, or if it was an educated guess based on how big Hank truly is. People appreciate data, she said to me. I was holding a towel in front of her so she could change at the lake. Naturally, I'd been sort of trying to tamp down my crush and sort of trying to let it do what it wants. So then later that day, when we got back from the lake and I dropped her off and was at my house getting ready to take myself to the movies, I heard scuffling on my roof and went outside to look. There was a giant white pigeon, like a foot above me on my stoop's overhang thing, huge for a pigeon, with a pink beak and giant pink feet. It took off in a rush and a feather fell from it. I don't know what % bigger. Then I went to the movies, not putting anything together. When I got home, my landladies were sitting in the dark garden. I joined them for a nightcap, and they told me about seeing this white bird in the yard. I saw it too, I said. That made me remember the poster for the pigeon. I felt worried that someone had been missing. I felt worried that someone had been missing their tame bird all this time, and I'd just gone to the movies. And I felt like I'd forgotten because I was getting all the posters mixed up with my stupid feelings for Maggie in some way. So the next day, I walked all over the neighborhood until I found a poster, and then I called the number. It was a weird guy. There's a certain kind of weird guy in this town, and they have a certain kind of voice, sort of lonely and sort of self-righteous. A kind of guy in a ham radio. He said the poster was about a gray pigeon, not a white one with pink feet like the one I saw, but that he'd actually lost a white one too, a while before that. He didn't sound at all freaked out, or relieved, or anything, and that started to make me mad. Next day I was biking over to Maggie's, and we were going to have brunch at a place that used to be a bank. There were leaves everywhere in the streets. I was thinking about the structure of many leaves coming from one tree. Then how they all fell away, but there was still that one tree. I thought about money, about bicycling through money swirling around in the street surrounded by bald trees as if the money had come from the trees, though of course not. This is the way I use my brain. Then there in the street was a weird guy. And some distance away, maybe a house worth of distance, there was a giant pigeon, and the guy was trying to coax it toward him. It was a black pigeon with red rims on its face. I didn't want to bicycle through them in this delicate moment, so I pulled over. I watched the man and the pigeon move in relation to each other like backward magnets. A cat that looked a lot like Hank sat on a porch and was definitely watching too. I tried to think of what percentage like Hank that cat was. Then I tried to think of what percentage like Hank the rest of us were, living on this earth. No cars were coming. I realized there was no way the man would know that I was the person who'd called him if he was the man that I'd called. So I said, "Hey, I've got to get through here, okay?" I said it the way I've heard people with Hummers say that to people like construction workers, or anyone really. It's amazing how urgent something like brunch can feel. But the weird guy didn't look up from the pigeon. I could have just gone right ahead through them, but something made me not do that, even though the guy was on another planet. He was on another planet in some kind of system that was beyond me. Something where he was in a network with a series of birds, white, gray, black, and maybe a whole separate weird guy on the phone interacting in a series of patterns. They tacked up these flyers onto trees, and some of the flyers were crumbling onto the streets. I let the man keep staring at the bird, and then I looked at the cat watching them too, like me. I backed up and went around the block. When I got to Maggie's, she was freaking out because she couldn't find she couldn't find Hank. Frank. She was afraid her neighbors might be harboring him. I said maybe he was just out chasing tail, and she threw a pillow at me. Then she went to make a phone call. I picked up the pillow and held it in front of me by two of its corners, the way I'd held up a towel a day ago. For a second, I thought about the posters all around town and let go of one of the corners. That's the opposite of a nail if you think about it. Maggie and I are the same height, and we have basically the same haircut. We both wear glasses part-time and contacts part-time, but I really couldn't tell you if it's the same amounts. There could be so many more things to aim my feelings at, and sometimes I think the right thing is hovering just above my left ear. But it's like every time I move, whatever the right thing is moves in exact relation to me. It makes me really want to get out of here, this whole brain space, this country, whatever made me the version of myself that I am. Vacation. The only cars left are tour vans and taxis. The visitors are from the country that provided the military. It's upstairs, downstairs, but continents. The last thing we remember is the sheen of all possible vacations. I was in the gift shop, choosing between a colorful calendar, Girls of the Apocalypse, and a colorful coffee table book, Voices from the Apocalypse. The guides, no matter who they're working for, share a special language of their own. Empty mountains echoed with their calls. The Lonely Shard. She took her laptop into bed to look at baby animals, so that the pattern was hard world, soft bed, hard computer, soft baby animals. What's inside after that was hard to tell because the telescoping stopped. She looked at baby polar bears first because that's what got it started, was feeling herself floating away from the melting iceberg mainland on her lonely shard. She moved on to puppies, a particular breed she'd had as a child that her parents had gotten rid of when they moved, the dog floating deeper into her past with every moment she remained alive. Her carpet was endless, but the animals were all so good and wronged that she started feeling better. But just as she started feeling better, a sick feeling seeped in to cover the inside of her stomach like fur. Just keep looking at them, she told herself. It's good for you no matter why. What would her male counterpart be doing? Looking at trucks? What would her destitute counterpart be doing? Counting stars? What would her animal counterpart be doing? Breathing, breathing, breathing. After. What was left? An enormous collection of transparencies. We couldn't be more minimal. That plastic cup, including the ice, your lenses, a stack of tracing paper, also tracing paper in the wind, and wind. Think of the bottles and bottles of water, including thinking. A matter of clear glass versus clear plastic versus gin versus vodka versus tap versus Voss. A room with 2 doors in shotgun fashion. I'll stand in this one. I couldn't care less. It looks like static coming down hand over fist. Now, if you stood in that opening, you'd ruin it. You can't even come in because of the enormous collection, wobbling invisibly. Thank you.